Some nights, life hands you something you weren't looking for. Most of us, if we're honest, have had a moment like that where a stranger appeared at exactly the right time. Or maybe it was you who appeared for somebody else. In a little Kansas town, the fall of 1883, a cowboy named Cole Sands walked out to his barn one night for a routine check before bed. What he found there wasn't anything he could have prepared for, and it changed the quiet, orderly life he'd built around himself in ways he never could have seen coming. Sometimes the smallest thing tips the whole world sideways. The lantern threw one long shadow across the barn floor, and Cole Sands stopped walking. There was a sound, not the horses, something smaller and more still. He lifted the lantern higher. The light climbed the wall of the far stall, up past the hay bale, and caught the shape of a woman sitting upright in the dark spine straight. Both arms wrapped around a cracked leather valise, like she had been holding it in her sleep and woke without letting go. She didn't flinch from the light. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, the way a person looks at a door waiting to see which way it would swing. Dust from the Union Pacific still clung to the hem of her calico dress. The jute twine on the bale had left red marks across the back of her hands. Cole didn't move. Neither did she. If this story stirred something in you a simpler time, a stranger's kindness, the way one unexpected night can change a life, tell us where you're watching from. As folks used to say, good neighbors are worth more than gold. He pulled a horse blanket off the stall rail, brown wool, stiff with cold, smelling of sweat and hay, and set it on the boards beside her without a word. Then he went back to the cabin. The cornbread was already cold in the skillet. He cut 2 squares, set them on the tin plate with the dent in the rim, and walked them back out across the yard. The September grass crackled under his boots. He set the plate on the top rail of her stall, didn't look at her directly. "One night," he said. She nodded once. He went back inside. The cabin was dark. Cole pulled out the chair, sat down at the table, and did not light the lamp. He put his hands around his enamel coffee pot. Stone cold. He didn't pour any. He just held it, outside. The cicadas were loud against the dark. A horse shifted in the barn, hooves dragging on the plank floor, then going quiet again. He ran his thumb around the inside rim of his tin cup, around and around, the same groove. Somewhere past 10 o'clock, he stood up and went to the window. There it was, a thin line of amber light under the barn door. She kept the lantern burning. He hadn't told her to conserve the oil. He hadn't told her anything except one night. He stood at the window and watched that line of light for a long time, his shoulder against the doorframe, his own lamp cold and dark on the shelf behind him. The line didn't waver, didn't go out. Cole turned back into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed with his boots still on and looked at the floor. 3 years in this cabin, and he had never once left a lamp burning past 9, not because he was careful with oil, because there was no reason to stay awake, nothing to wait for, no sound he wanted to hear. He pulled off one boot, set it down, then he stopped. From the barn, barely audible one sound, small, a cough, maybe, or a breath caught short against the wool blanket. Cole held the second boot in both hands and did not move. She hadn't said where she was going in the morning. He hadn't asked. The smell reached him before he was fully awake. Wood smoke, dry and sharp, with something underneath it, cornmeal scorching, just past done on a cast-iron skillet. Cole sat up. His boots were still on his feet. He'd never done that before. Never fallen asleep with his boots on in this cabin. He stood and went to the door. Outside, the September air hit the back of his neck, cool from the night. He stepped onto the porch and stopped. She had swept it. The broom with the cracked handle, bound in twine, the one he kept propped against the wall and hadn't touched in 2 months, was leaned up differently. The dead leaves and the drifted grit that had collected in the corners of the porch boards were gone. She must have swept before first light. Must have worked quiet so the bristles wouldn't scrape loud enough to hear. Cole turned and went inside. The cast-iron wood stove was going. His own coffee was already made, the enamel pot sitting on the front plate. A thin thread of steam off the spout. She'd found the coffee tin above the wash basin. The one with the tin lid that fit loose and always let in dust. She'd measured it differently than he did. Stronger. The smell of it was sharper than what he made for himself. Clara stood at the stove with her back to him. She had the wooden spoon in her right hand, his spoon, worn smooth at the grip from years of use, and she was stirring something in the skillet. Her calico dress had a small tear at the left shoulder seam. She hadn't had it when she arrived. It must have caught on the stall rail during the night. Her feet were bare on the swept board floor. Cole's boots hit the floor with a heavier step than he intended. She turned at the sound, just her head and shoulders, looking at him over her shoulder the same way she'd looked at him the night before in the barn, waiting to see which way the door swings. "Cornmeal mush," she said. "Found a half sack in the pantry. I hope that's all right." She turned back to the skillet. She poured the mush into 2 bowls, 1 tin, 1 chipped earthenware, and set them on the table. The tin bowl in front of the chair facing the window, the earthenware in front of the empty place across from it. She sat down. She picked up her spoon. Cole stood in the middle of the room. "What are you doing?" he said. She swallowed what she had in her mouth. "Earning my keep," she said. "If you'll let me." Cole put his hat on the wall peg. He looked at the bowl she'd set out. He looked at the window. The early light was pale and flat across the fields. The grass still gray. The sky not yet fully decided. "I can't have a woman staying on my property," Penny said. Clara set her spoon down on the edge of the bowl. "Not hard. Just set it down." "Then I'll sleep in the barn," she said. "And work for my meals till I've saved enough for stage fare to somewhere sensible." She picked up her spoon again. "You won't have to see me much." She said it the way a person says a thing they've already worked out in full before saying it, no hesitation in the words, no pleading in the voice. Just a plain proposal, the same tone a man would use to settle the terms of a fence repair. Cole pulled out the chair. He sat down. The mush was warm, salted right. He didn't know where she'd found the salt. He kept it in a small tin crock on the shelf above the wash basin, and had never mentioned it to anyone. She'd found it on her own, in a cabin that wasn't hers. In the dark, before dawn, he ate. She ate. Neither of them spoke for the full length of the meal. When Cole set down his spoon, the bowl was 2/3 empty. He pushed back from the table. He stood and took his hat off the peg. He held it in both hands for a moment, the brim between his thumbs, the same way he held it at funerals and at church. The 2 times a man doesn't know what to do with his hands. 1 second, 2, 3. He put it on and went to the door. "Fence line on the north pasture needs checking," he said, not to her, exactly. To the room, to the open door. "Be back by noon." He didn't wait for her to answer. His boots were loud on the porch steps, loud on the yard dirt. And then he was heading toward the corral. He stopped 20 feet from the door and looked back. The cabin window glass was old and thick, the surface wavy the way all hand-poured glass goes. It bent the room behind it slightly, stretched the shapes. Through it he could see Clara at the table. She sat for one still moment. Then she stood, carried both bowls to the tin wash basin, and poured cold water over them from the pitcher. She picked up the lye soap bar and worked it between her palms. She washed both bowls and set them on the basin's edge to drain. She wiped her hands on her apron. She stood at the table, two chairs pushed back from where they'd been sitting. She looked at them for a moment. Cole couldn't read through the wavy glass. Then she turned toward the stove. Cole turned away from the window and walked to the corral. His own cup was still on the shelf above the wash basin. Full, cold. He had never poured it. He had sat down, eaten, stood up, and walked out without drinking a single drop of coffee on a morning he had made it himself. He did not know when he had last done that. He was not certain he ever had. The kitchen garden was behind the cabin. On the south side, where the ground got the most sun, Cole had turned it once, 3 springs ago, and planted nothing. The earth had gone back to itself, hard red clay packed down under a crust of dead weed stems. Volunteer grass in thick mats between the old furrow lines, seed pods rattling on stems gone gray and brittle. At supper the night before, Clara had set his tin bowl in front of him and said, without looking up from the stove, "The well water tastes like iron. Does it go off worse by August?" Cole had said it did. "Then there's better water somewhere close," she said. "There usually is, on land like this." He had said nothing to that, but it sat in him through the night the way a splinter sits small, specific, impossible to stop noticing. Clara found the garden hoe propped under the porch. The handle had a crack running 4 inches up from the blade socket, wrapped with a strip of rawhide gone stiff and dark. She carried it around to the south side of the cabin and stood looking at the plot for a moment, then drove the blade into the ground. The crust cracked but didn't give easily. She worked the hoe back and levered up a chunk of earth the size of a boot heel, set it aside, drove the blade in again. Cole came back from the north fence at mid-morning and put his horse in the corral. He could hear the rhythmic crack of the hoe blade from around the back of the cabin. He stayed at the fence rail. The sound stopped. Then it started again. By noon, Clara had turned 3 rows. The red clay lay broken and raw, smelling of iron and old root matter. She had pulled the dead weed stems by hand and stacked them at the far edge of the plot. Sweat had worked through the back of her calico dress in a dark strip between her shoulder blades. The tear at her left shoulder seam had widened another half-inch. She didn't stop for the noon hour. Cole ate his salt pork and hardtack alone at the table and listened to the hoe working the ground outside the south wall. At 4 o'clock, the sound stopped and didn't start again. He put the coffee on. Clara came in 10 minutes later. She set the hoe against the wall just inside the door. Her apron was dark with dirt from the knees down. She went to the wash basin and poured water from the pitcher over her hands. The water ran off rust-colored. Cole looked at her hands when she turned to dry them. The pads below her fingers were red, the skin raised in 2 blisters on her right palm. The larger one had broken. She saw him looking. She went to the table, opened her sewing tin, took out the kitchen scissors. She reached under her skirt and cut a strip from the hem of her petticoat 6 inches wide. Clean white cotton, and wrapped her right palm with it, tucking the end under to hold it. She did it herself, without asking, without looking up. At supper, Cole put down his fork. "You didn't have to do the garden," he said. Clara broke a piece of cornbread in half. "Ground was wasted?" She dipped it in her bowl. "You've got the seed packets sitting on the windowsill doing nothing?" She nodded toward the shelf, 2 paper envelopes behind the salt crock, curled at the edges from the damp. Cole looked at them. He had bought those packets at the Millbrook Mercantile in the spring of 1881. Pole beans and summer squash. He had put them on that shelf and left them there for 2.5 years. "The squash is late," Clara said. "But beans still have time if the warm holds." She looked at him across the table. "You asked about the iron water this morning. There's a creek line south. I can smell cottonwood from the ridge. If it runs sweet, it'd be better for cooking." She paused. "Better for the garden, too." Cole picked his fork back up. He didn't say anything to that. They finished eating in quiet. Clara washed the dishes. Cole pushed back from the table and sat for a while looking at the south wall of the cabin, behind which 3 turned rows of red clay were waiting in the cooling dark. Then he stood and took his hat off the peg. "Come on," he said. He walked her out through the early evening, past the corral and the far fence post, through the knee-high grass along a low ridge running toward the tree line. The cicadas were loud. Clara's skirt caught on the dried grass stems, and she pulled it free twice without breaking stride. Cole stopped at the ridge edge where the ground fell away in a shallow cut toward a line of cottonwood trees. A creek moved between them, catching what was left of the light. It came up clean over flat rocks, running without sound. "Run sweet all year," Cole said. He was looking at the water, not at her. "Better than the well for cooking. Better for drinking, too." He paused. "Better for the garden." He had given her reason back in her own words without meaning to, and stood with that fact between them and the sound of the water. And neither of them said anything further. Clara looked at the creek for a long moment. The last lights sat in it, pale and still. Cole turned back toward the cabin. She followed a step behind, and neither of them noticed, until they were almost to the porch, that Cole had walked the path home without counting a single step. 2 weeks in, Cole noticed the quilt. It had been folded over the back of the single chair by the window since the second winter he lived in the cabin, put there by his own hands, the evening he decided the chest under the bed was too much trouble to open every night. He hadn't looked at it directly in a year. Brown and blue squares stitched in a log cabin pattern, the kind a woman makes on long afternoons with leftover cotton scraps. His mother had made one like it. He didn't know who had made this one. It had come with the cabin when he bought the property. Clara had moved it to the rocking chair. She'd folded it differently, smaller, neater. The blue squares facing out and draped it over the chair's arm so it sat like it had always meant to be there. She hadn't said anything about it. Cole noticed it one morning when the light came through the west window at the right angle and caught the blue cotton, and he stopped in the middle of pulling on his second boot. He put the boot on and went outside. There were other things. A dried yellow flower prairie goldenrod, the kind that grew in the shallow wash behind the north fence, pressed flat and tucked under the edge of the tin plate on the shelf, a second tin cup set out beside his own above the wash basin. Where before there had been only one, the cup was his spare, kept in the back of the lower cabinet for the 2 or 3 times a year he had a visitor. Clara had washed it and put it at the front. Every morning it was there, clean and waiting. Cole rode out each day and came back earlier than the work required. He found detours that added distance. They didn't help much. The corral was only 40 yards from the cabin window, and the cabin window threw a yellow rectangle of kerosene light across the yard from sundown onward. One evening in the third week, Cole came back from the east pasture to find Clara on the porch with his work shirt across her knees, a needle threaded with brown cotton. Working on the split seam at the left shoulder, she had the tobacco tin she used as a sewing box open on the porch boards beside her foot. The kerosene lamp sat on the porch rail, its flame steady in the still air. Cole set down the saddle soap and the worn rag he'd brought out to work on the bridle, and sat on the step below the porch. He pulled the bridle across his knee and uncapped the saddle soap tin. They worked in the same quiet for a while, cicadas going hard in the grass below the ridge. Somewhere past the barn, a nighthawk called twice and stopped. "You're from Ohio," Segal said. He already knew it, but he said it anyway. "Dayton." She bit the thread. "You ever been—" "No, nothing much there you'd miss." She turned the shirt over and examined the seam from the outside, pulling it gently with 2 fingers to test the tension. "Flat, green in summer, cold the other 6 months. Kansas isn't much different." "It's different." She looked out past the porch rail at the grass moving in the dark. "The sky's bigger here. Back home it always felt like the sky was something sitting on top of things. Here it goes all the way down." Cole worked the cloth in a circle on the bridle leather. "What made you come?" he said. Clara folded the shirt and set it on the rail beside the lamp. "Same thing that makes most people come. Thought there was something better waiting." She fitted the lid on the sewing tin. Turned out the something better was just a different kind of nothing. "Goss. Goss." She said the name flat, without anger, the way a person says the name of a place they drove through once and won't be going back to. He had nice penmanship. I'll give him that. Cole set the bridle down. From the far side of the barn, the gray barn cat appeared at the corner of the building, stopped, looked at something in the dark grass, and launched itself sideways, 4 legs cycling in the air. Purchase on nothing, and landed wrong and skidded in the dirt and sat up blinking at its own indignity. Clara laughed. It came out of her fast and unguarded, and she put the back of her wrist over her mouth a half-second after. Cole went still. He looked down at the bridle. The saddle soap cloth had stopped moving. From the barn, the cat sat in the dirt and washed its face with one paw as if nothing had happened. He kept his eyes down for a long time. When he finally looked up, Clara was watching the dark past the lamp with her hands in her lap, and the lamp between them threw its small circle of light on the porch boards. Cole picked the bridle back up. "North fence is mended," he said. It came out low. Clara turned and looked at him. "You told me that 2 weeks ago," she said. He had. He hadn't realized he was going to say it again until it was already out of his mouth. And now there was no accounting for it. And he had no second sentence to follow with. He worked the cloth in a slow circle on the leather and did not look up again. The following morning, the stage from Wichita rolled through Millbrook. Cole knew because he always knew the stage schedule. The southbound ran Tuesdays and Fridays at 10:30. He had not once thought about it in 2 weeks. Cole's supply runs to Millbrook fell on the first Saturday of every month. He went alone, tied his horse at the rail outside Pruitt's Mercantile, bought what he needed, and was back on the road within the hour. He'd done it that way for 3 years. He asked Clara on a Thursday evening, the way he'd ask a fence post, "Need anything from Millbrook Saturday?" He didn't look up from the harness he was mending. Clara was at the table with the tobacco tin open, rethreading a needle by lamplight. "Thread," she said. "Black. If they have it, and I'll come. If that's all right. Cole pulled the leather through the awl hole. Wagon leaves at 7. She was on the bench at 10 to 7 with her hands folded in her lap and a small folded letter tucked inside her apron pocket. 1 page. Cream stationery. Written out the night before by lamplight after Cole had gone to bed. She had mentioned it at supper her cousin Dorothy Marsh in Street. Louis, who used to sew for a dress shop. Who might know of honest work? Cole had said nothing. He'd eaten and cleared his bowl and gone outside, and when he came back and the lamp on the table was still burning and Clara was pressing the envelope flat with the heel of her hand. They rode the 6 miles in the morning cool, the wagon wheels raising a thin red dust that settled slow on the roadside weeds. Clara watched the country pass the flat Kansas roll, the cottonwoods dark along the creek draws. Millbrook had one main street of packed dirt, a church at the north end and a livery at the south. Cole tied the team at Pruitt's rail. 2 men on the bench outside the feed barn stopped talking when the wagon pulled up. Inside the mercantile, the floors smelled of coal oil and raw wood, and the faint sweetness of loose tobacco from the glass case near the door. The storekeeper, Pruitt, stood behind the counter, tallying a ledger, a narrow man with gray side whiskers and ink on 2 fingers. He looked up. His eyes moved from Cole to Clara and back to Cole. Morning, Sands. Morning. Cole put his list on the counter. While Pruitt pulled items from the shelves, Clara crossed to the dry goods side. She ran her finger along a bolt of blue check calico. Then she found a spool of black thread on the lower shelf and carried it to the counter. She turned to Cole. The post office window, can I use it while you finish here? Counter's in back, Pruitt said, without being asked. Clara went to the rear of the store. The post window was a plank shelf with a brass wicket and a glass inkwell. She handed her letter across. The clerk, a young man with a sparse mustache, took it, weighed it in his palm, told her the rate. She counted out the coins from the small flat purse she kept pinned inside her aprons. When she came back to the front of the store, Mrs. Alcott was standing near the calico bolts. The minister's wife moved through a room like she'd been expected. Miss Whitfield. The pleasantness had a floor to it. Mrs. Alcott. It's a hard road, coming to a strange place alone. Mrs. Alcott folded her hands at her waist. You planning to stay on at the Sands place long? Clara looked at the thread spool in her hand. Then she met Mrs. Alcott's eyes evenly. I work for my room, Mrs. Alcott, same as a hired hand. She paused. I expect that's respectable enough. Mrs. Alcott studied her for a moment, then nodded once, not warm, not cold, and moved to the household shelf and began examining a tin of stove blacking, as though that had been her purpose all along. At the main counter, Pruitt set down the last item on Cole's list. He added the total on a scrap of paper without looking up. Hear you've had some company out at your place, he said. People around here, they get a picture in their head. Man in your situation ought to be careful about appearances. Clara set her thread spool and 1 coin on the counter. Much obliged for the thread, she said, and turned for the door. Cole set a 50-pound flour sack on the counter with both hands, the full weight of it settling into the plank. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt found something to write on the paper. Cole paid and carried everything to the wagon in 2 trips. Clara was already on the bench. They rode the 6 miles back in quiet. A mile from the cabin, she said, I didn't need you to do that. Flour bin's been near empty 2 weeks, Cole said. Clara looked at the road ahead. When they pulled around back to unload, She climbed down and reached into the wagon bed for the smaller box. Cole took it from her, their hands on the wood at the same time, for one step before he had it. She stepped back and looked toward the road to Millbrook, still visible as a pale line through the grass. She had handed the letter across the post window without once thinking about who else in that town might already know her name. Herbert Goss had turned her away at his door. That door was 6 miles behind her. She had never once asked where. Exactly. In Millbrook, he lived. The reply from Saint. Louis came 3 weeks after the supply run to Millbrook. Clara had mailed her letter at the post window while Cole was loading the flour, 1 page of cream stationery. Folded twice. She had told him at supper that same evening her cousin Dorothy Marsh, the one who used to sew for a dress shop, who might know of honest work somewhere sensible. Cole had picked up his fork and eaten. The reply came on a Tuesday, brought by the post rider and left wedged under a stone on the porch. Clara read it at the table before Cole came in from the fields, then folded it twice and put it in her apron pocket. She said nothing about it at supper. She said nothing the following morning. On the 3rd day, Cole found the valise. He had come back from the east pasture at mid-afternoon, a fence post down in the creek bend, soft soil, the kind of repair that goes easy if you have the right iron bar. He had it. He was back earlier than usual. He stepped through the cabin door and stopped. The valise sat on the floor between the table and the stove, open. One side already packed her second dress, the gray wool one she didn't wear much, 2 cotton shirtwaists nested inside each other, her Bible with the cracked spine. The other side lay waiting. She'd been in the middle of it when something pulled her away, and she'd left it gaping on the floor. The kerosene lamp was unlit. Afternoon light came through the west window. The log cabin quilt sat over the rocking chair arm. Blue squares out, the way Clara had arranged it the second week. The dried goldenrod was still pressed under the edge of the shelf tin. He stood there until he heard the well rope creak outside. Then he stepped over the valise and hung his hat on the peg. Clara came in with the water bucket. She saw him standing at the table. She set the bucket on the shelf without spilling. "Dorothy has a room," she said. "Her husband's cousin moved out in August. She says I can have it through winter at least. She knows a woman who sews for a clothier on Vine Street." She pulled the letter from her apron and set it on the table beside his hand, not pushing it toward him, just setting it down. "I've been here longer than one night, longer than we agreed." Her voice was level, the way it always was. "I won't be a weight on anybody." "You're not a weight," Cole said. "Then what am I?" He opened his mouth. The cabin was very quiet. The sound of the water buckets settling, the wind off the grass pushing lightly at the south wall. He stood with his mouth open for 2 full seconds and shut it again. Clara turned to the stove and lifted the lid on the salt pork pot. Cole went out. The path from the cabin to the barn was 22 steps of packed dirt. Earlier, there had been a fast afternoon shower, 20 minutes, the kind that moves through quick and leaves the ground dark and slick. Cole took the path fast. On the 14th step, his right boot went wrong on the wet clay. His foot slid out sideways, fully and without warning, and he went down hard, left knee first, both palms flat in the mud, face dropping toward the ground before he caught himself. He stayed there, both palms pressed into the wet red-black earth, his knees soaked through the trouser cloth, the cold mud rising between his fingers, chin 6 inches from the ground. A grown man on all fours in the yard between his own cabin and his own barn. He did not get up immediately. The kerosene lamp had come on inside. He could see the yellow edge of it through the window glass. He could hear, faint but clear, the sound of Clara moving in the kitchen, the pot lid settling, the soft knock of the wooden spoon against the iron. She was making supper. She was making supper for a man who had just stood with his mouth open and said nothing when she asked him the one question that needed an answer. And now that man was on his hands and knees in the mud, because he had walked too fast on wet clay and couldn't manage 22 steps without going down. He pushed himself up. His hands were black to the wrist. He wiped them on his trouser legs. It didn't do much. He walked the rest of the path to the barn and pulled the door open and went inside. He stood in the dark a moment, then found the lantern peg and lit the coal oil. The smell of horses and old hay settled around him. He pulled the bay mare out by the halter and took the soft brush from the hook. He started on her withers, long, slow strokes back toward the flank. The mare was clean. He had brushed her that morning. He kept brushing. The only sounds were the rasp of bristles and the mare shifting her weight, and the wind moving through the grass outside the barn wall. Cole's hands had dried to a rust stain between the knuckles. He could still feel where the mud had been. Then what am I? She'd said it without anger, without pleading. Just a plain question a person asks when they need a plain answer. And she'd stood there and waited. And he had given her nothing, not a word, not a gesture, not even the honesty of saying he didn't know. He had simply stood there with his mouth open, and then walked away and then fallen down in his own yard. He hung the brush back up. He stood with both hands on the stall rail and looked at the mare's flank and tried to work it out. The way a man works a stone from a post-hole patient, piece by piece. He had something, maybe half of something. He had been standing in his kitchen across from a woman who had swept his porch and fixed his shirt and planted beans in his wasted garden and set a second cup on his shelf every morning for 3 weeks. And she had asked him what she was to him. And the only thing that had come out of his mouth was silence. He had an answer now. It was not a large answer, but it was the true one, which was the only kind that had ever worked on ground this hard. The supper smell had reached the barn. Cole turned and looked at the barn door. The line of light under it was warm and steady. He put his hand on the wood and pushed it open, and walked the 22 steps back. Careful this time. Both boots solid on the wet clay. He counted them without meaning to old habit, the kind that comes back when a man is paying attention to something that matters. He reached the porch steps and stopped with one boot on the first riser. Through the wavy window glass, he could see Clara at the stove, her back to him. The valise was still visible on the floor behind her, gaping open, the gray dress folded in the bottom, the empty side waiting. She hadn't closed it. He stopped at the cabin door. Inside, the kerosene lamp was lit on the table. Clara sat with her back to him, a length of blue-checked calico flat across her knees, the same bolt she had touched at Pruitt's during the Millbrook run. She must have bought a remnant of it at the end, after Cole had loaded the flour. He hadn't seen her do it. She was working with a needle and thread, hemming the edge with small, even stitches. She was not writing to Dorothy Marsh. She was sewing. Cole stood in the doorway with the mud dry on his trouser knee and the smell of the barn still in his shirt horse, sweat and coal oil and old hay, and watched her pull the thread through and pull it through again. He could leave. He could say he'd forgotten to check the water trough. He could go back to the barn and brush the bay again, though she was cleaner than a horse had any right to be. He had done that before, gone to the barn instead of staying. worked at something finished instead of starting the thing that needed starting. He stepped inside. Clara's needle did not pause. Cole pulled out the chair across the table from her and sat down. He put both hands flat on the table in front of him, palms down. He looked at them. The rust stain from the mud was still between the knuckles of his right hand. The lamp between them threw two shadows against the wall, his wide in the shoulders, hers narrower, the edge of her bun catching the light. He had come in here to say something. He had worked it out in the barn, the way he worked every hard thing carefully, without rushing. He had the shape of it. One sentence, plain and true. His mouth was dry. He thought about his father. Not in any ordered way, just the image of the man at the table in the old cabin in the winters after Cole's mother had gone. His father hadn't spoken much about it. Hadn't spoken much about anything. Toward the end, he just worked and came inside and ate and sat and went to bed. The cabin had the feel of a place where something used to be and wasn't anymore. Cole had been somewhere around 15. He had watched his father sit exactly the way Cole was sitting now, hands flat, looking at the table. He had not understood it then. He understood it now. He had become the same man, not through any single morning, through nothing at all, which was the whole of it. No second cup set out, no second chair pulled up, no sound in the morning that wasn't his own. He had let it happen, the way a fence post rots slow, from the ground up, invisible until the day you lean on it and it gives. The valise on the floor, the gray dress folded in the bottom of it. His hands were still on the table. There were real reasons he had not tried. The spread was modest. The work was hard and constant. He had one winter behind him that had shown clearly what it cost to expect something from another person and then not have it. Those were all true. A man can build a wall out of true things, just the same as false ones, and stand behind it just as well either way, and call it sense. Cole reached into his shirt pocket. His fingers found the brass buckle he'd been carrying since the barn the bay's headstall roller, soft at the tongue slot, needing replacement before it gave way entirely. He'd been meaning to bring it inside for 2 weeks. His hand had gone to it in the barn without his thinking about it, the way a hand goes to whatever is near. He set it on the table between them. Clara's needle stopped. She looked at the buckle, then at his hands, then back at the calico on her knees. "I got used to hearing somebody move around in the morning," Cole said. His voice came out lower than he intended. Not rough, just quiet. Clara held the needle still. "Be hard to stop," he said. The September insects were working the dark outside. A steady wall of sound through the south wall. The lamp burned between them without flickering. The cream stationery, from Dorothy Marsh's letter, sat on the cabinet shelf where Clara had put it 3 days ago, folded. Not answered. Not acted on. "That's not much of a reason," Clara said. "To ask a woman to stay? No." Cole looked at his hands. He looked at the rust stain. He said, "I got a better one. I just haven't found the right words for it yet." The lamp made a small tick, the metal chimney cooling from the night air coming through the door gap. The kind of sound a person stops hearing after the first week in a house and never notices again. Clara looked at him. Not the measuring look from the barn on the first night, not door watching. Something quieter than that. She folded the calico once and set it on the table beside the lamp. She held the needle for a moment, then pressed it into the pincushion on the tobacco tin lid. "Take your time," she said. Cole sat with his hands on the table, the brass buckle between them, the lamp making its small circle of warm light on the wood. After a while, Clara stood and went to the stove. She lifted the lid on the pot salt pork smell spread into the room, set it back down, and turned the damper a half turn. She moved the way she always moved in the cabin without hurrying, without asking, as if she already knew where everything belonged, which she did. Cole sat still. The valise was on the floor behind her, between the table and the stove, gaping open the way she had left it, the gray wool dress folded in the bottom, the other side empty and waiting. She hadn't closed it, but she had set down the calico she was sewing and pressed her needle into the pincushion, and said, "Take your time," and her voice when she said it carried no pleading and no conditions. Just the plain patience of someone who intended to be in the room when the right words finally arrived. Cole looked at the valise. He looked at the pot lid settling on the stove. He looked at the blue-checked calico folded beside the lamp. She had bought that fabric in Millbrook with her own coins, the same trip where she'd mailed the letter to St. Louis, the same trip where Pruitt had made his comments and she had answered him with her chin level and walked out ahead of Cole without being asked. She had bought calico on the same day she mailed a letter asking for a way out. Cole did not know what that meant exactly. He thought he might need to. That night, after supper, Cole carried the valise. He didn't ask. Clara was at the stove with her back to him, setting the lid back on the pot. And Cole reached down and lifted the valise by its baling wire handle and pressed the top shut with one hand. The latch caught. He carried it to the bedroom and set it under the bed, pushing it back against the wall with one boot until it sat level and out of the way. He came back out to the kitchen. Clara had turned from the stove. She watched him come back to the table and sit down. He put both hands on the wood, the same way he had all evening. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "if you're willing." The salt pork smell was still in the room. The lamp was burning at the table's center. Clara stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in her hand and looked at him for a long moment, not weighing it, just taking it in. "All right," she said. That was the whole of it. Sunday morning came in cold and clear. The sky was pale at the edges and sharp blue overhead, and the cabin smelled of coffee already made when Cole pulled on his boots. The stove was going, 2 cups on the shelf. The rocking chair by the south window with the cotton batting cushion Clara had sewn one evening and set in place without discussion. Cole had sat in it that same night and felt the difference and said nothing and rocked. He drank his coffee at the table. Clara drank hers standing at the window, looking out at the south field where the garden rows were visible as dark lines in the dry grass. The beans had given 2 good pickings before the first frost came. The squash had been late in the ground and yielded less than she'd hoped, but it had yielded. 4 mason jars of beans sat on the lower cabinet shelf, sealed with wax. Cole set his cup down. "Ought to ride out and look at the north fence." Clara turned from the window. "I'll come." They rode out in the late morning light, Cole on the bay, Clara on the gray gelding he kept for rough work, steady and unhurried. The grass was still tall in the low places, gone to seed at the tips, the seed heads catching light in long, pale lines across the field. Their horses moved through it on the narrow track, close enough that saddle leather occasionally brushed a flank. The north fence came up along the ridge in good order, cedar posts reset in July, wire pulled tight and stapled clean. Cole brought the bay to a stop and Clara pulled up beside him. The September grass ran in every direction, moving in the slow wind off the creek draw. Far to the south, the cabin roofline showed above the ground swell, and above it a thin thread of smoke from the stovepipe. Clara looked at it for a while. "Spring planting will come early this year," she said, "if the ground stays workable." Usually does, Lola said. Ground's easier in the south plot. Better drainage. I'll need more seed. Beans, especially. She looked at the fence line. And something for the east plot that Clay wants breaking before November. Cole looked at the fence posts. He had told her about this fence the second week she was here, standing at the table eating cornmeal mush while he had stood at the door holding his hat in both hands before going out. She'd nodded then the same way she nodded now, as if the information belonged to a plan she was already carrying. They rode back through the long grass, the horses close on the narrow track. At the creek bend, the path widened and the horses drifted apart for 50 yards. Then came back together at the corral gate without being asked. Cole unsaddled at the post rail. Clara put the gelding in his stall and forked hay without being told. She came back out through the corral gate and latched it behind her, and Cole saw her look once toward the road to Millbrook, a pale line through the dry grass 6 miles east. He had heard in town that Goss had left Millbrook. A man at the feed barn had mentioned it 3 weeks back, offhand. The way such things get mentioned, gone to Wichita, took a position with the land company. No one knew exactly when. Cole had not told Clara. He wasn't certain why, except that it hadn't seemed necessary. The road was just a road. Clara turned from it and walked to the cabin. Inside, the afternoon light was warm through the west window, the wavy glass bending it slightly. The blue-checked calico curtain Clara had sewn and hung over the south window caught the light from the other side and went pale gold along its hem. She'd hung it 2 days after Cole had put the valise under the bed, measured the window, cut the cloth, pressed the rod casing flat with her thumbnail, slid it over the nail Cole had driven at her direction. They had stood back and looked at it together, and she had said it was a little short on the left side. Cole had said it looked fine. He had meant it. They ate supper at the table. Salt pork and cornbread, same as most nights. Clara cleared the bowls. Cole put fresh wood on the stove and turned the damper down. At dusk, they took their coffee out to the porch. The sky was going orange above the western grass line, the color working up through pink and thinning into pale gray. The cicadas had quit for the season. Nighthawks were cutting back and forth over the dark grass below the ridge. Cole stood at the porch rail with his cup in his left hand. Clara pulled the rocking chair to the rail and sat down with her cup in both hands, the cotton cushion under her. The kerosene lamp inside threw a warm rectangle across the porch boards between them. Neither of them spoke for a while. Cole set his cup on the rail and put his right hand flat on the wood beside it. Clara set her cup down and put her hand on the rail close to his, not touching, just there, in the space beside him. Cole covered it with his palm over her knuckles, warm from the cup. He did not say anything. He looked at the sky going out over the grass. Out past the barn, the land settled into the dark, the grass bending one way and then the other in a slow roll that had no beginning and no particular end. The same grass that had been here before Cole arrived and would be here long after the fence posts went soft. It moved in the dark, the way it always moved, not for any reason, just because the wind was there and the grass was there, and that was the whole of it. They stayed on the porch until the stars came out clear, and the lamp burned low, and neither of them moved to go in. Under the bed, pushed back against the wall where it was out of the way, the valise sat closed. The baling wire repair on the strap had not been tested in weeks. The gray wool dress was folded inside it, undisturbed. The letter to Dorothy Marsh in Saint. Lewis was still on the cabinet shelf, unanswered. A second rocking chair moved in the night air beside the first, and the porch boards carried the sound of both without complaint. There's something quiet that settles after a story like this one. Not quite relief, not quite sadness. Something in between the way a room feels after company has gone, and the warmth from the stove is still there, and the 2 cups are still on the shelf, but the voices have gone still. Many of us have carried something like what Cole carried. Not a ranch, not a barn, not a woman on a hayloft floor, but that particular weight of holding a thing in both hands and not finding the words for it. Some of us know what it is to stay quiet too long about something that mattered. Some of us know what it is to have someone set their hand beside yours on the rail and simply wait. You don't have to make sense of it tonight. The feeling is allowed to stay a little unresolved, warm, and tender, and not quite finished, the way the best things often are. That's all right. It doesn't need a name. We're glad you stayed with Cole and Clara all the way to the porch. Thank you for being here with us. It means more than we can say.